Hello and welcome back. In the previous section, we looked into end-to-end implementation of ABAP RAP Managed scenario, and in that we took a very basic and simple example. Now, what we are going to do before we actually go for a complicated example with association and composition, I would like to give you an end-to-end spectrum with the managed scenario. Now, in this case, we need to understand certain bit of theory to better understand the hands-on. So if you're trying to break this SADL framework, then we have one component of SAP Gateway, and we have the second component of this orchestration framework. And we have already discussed that the gateway acts as a web server, and it basically treats the external OData request and basically fulfills those by invoking the internal functionality. So that is basically what the gateway is for. And here's the user with the request, or maybe it can be API endpoint by a third-party program. So that is handled by the gateway. Now, what is this orchestration framework we are talking about? Now, the orchestration framework, as the name suggests, it is acting as a manager. Now, what it manages? So whatever the implementation code we have the behavior definition and we have the behavior implementation. So in the managed scenario, the behavior implementation part is all internally taken care. So the only part we actually worked on was the behavior definition. The implementation are created in the runtime. When the actual operation are running, then the implementation code are automatically invoked based on this definition. Now, what are the respective code, when they are going to be generated, which functionality should be invoked first, then second, then third, and so on. So all that is managed by this orchestration framework. So it acts as a manager which works on all that. So this transaction implementation, we have the ABAP code of the behavior implementation, which is internally invoked. Now, when we talk about these cases, they are going to be same in managed and unmanaged scenario as well. So we are not only just talking about, okay, managed scenario and this behavior implementation is internally invoked and I don't want to discuss that. We have to also understand it in regards of a generic way of how this operation actually work. So the transaction implementation is basically the behavior implementation we are talking about. And the EML here, what is EML? Why this has come into place? Now, EML we have mentioned here because when we create the implementation of our services, then we use certain special kind of ABAP code, and this ABAP code are specifically created so it can do transactional based update on the database. So the EML syntaxes are part of ABAP by using which you can perform modification, read, or saving some data in the database. So that is the EML here. So together, the orchestration framework and this EML and the transaction implementation of behavior implementation, they actually are the central component when it comes to the runtime, which goes inside your HANA systems. Now let's club all this together. So this center component is the interest what we have now, because now we are going to discuss about one of the most important thing is runtime stages. Now, when we talk about the runtime stages, we are actually referring to certain steps. Now, these steps are basically how your application internally will be flowing. Now, the first stage here is the interaction phase. So in the interaction phase, you are basically executing the behavior code and all the behavior implementation code. It can be runtime generated, or you have written your code in unmanaged scenario and you're talking about those code. So that code is getting executed, and that code basically interact with certain internal storage, and this is internal ABAP tables, which we call as intermediate storage. And these intermediate storage are then, with the help of a save sequence stored in the database. So that is basically 3 stages. First is the execution of our code of behavior implementation or runtime behavior implementation generated code. Then this intermediate storage of our data, and finally writing the data which is in the intermediate stage into database table. Now these 3 steps are your runtime stages.